So far, we've spoken about two of the most powerful, or the most powerful, impulses and forces in the human soul: pleasure and will. That is the motivating, the moving force that gets us to get up and go and do and pursue. What is the opposite of that? What is the passive side of our personality? What is indifference? It's obviously not pleasure, and it's not will. It's indifference. I don't care. I don't want. I don't enjoy. The lack or the absence of will or pleasure that results in indifference, we would assume is an unhealthy and negative condition. You don't want anything? It's not good. You don't find pleasure in anything? That's dangerous. Sounds depressed. Generally, it is. Indifference is considered the worst evil. Worse than bad pleasure or criminal will. At least you want something. If you're going to be a ganef, be a good ganef, Work at it. Be ambitious. Perfect the craft. But don't be indifferent. Indifference is considered the most unholy. There's a commandment or a law in the section on prayer that you're not allowed to interrupt your prayers for any occasion because you're speaking to God and nothing should distract you from that. But what if there's a snake threatening you? Don't interrupt the prayer. If there's a scorpion threatening you, interrupt the prayer and get out of there. What is the difference? Spiritually, in terms of the soul, the snake is a hot venom, and the scorpion is a cold venom. It deadens. Instead of burning the tissue or whatever, it deadens the tissue. So here's the point. If you're excited about something, and then some other excitements kind of interfere, don't interrupt. Keep going. Drag the other excitement along. Because as long as it's excited, it's warm, it's enthusiastic, it'll catch on. It'll become part of your prayer, part of your davening. But if you're starting to feel a coldness settling in, you can't just continue praying. You got to stop and figure out what's wrong, and then start all over again with a new inspiration. Because coldness is related to death. Your grandparents might have told you this also. In Yiddish, you never say, I am cold. Now you say to your grandmother, I'm cold. They say, God forbid. Cold is lifeless. You say, I feel cold. It's cold in the room. Never say, I am cold. Because that sounds cadaverous. So indifference on the surface would be dismissed as lifeless, bad, unholy, negative, depressive. But there's got to be a positive side as well. Let's look at some of the positive side. God takes the Jews into the desert. No promise of food or water. And the Jews follow without question. They don't ask, what are we going to eat? What are we going to drink? Of course, they made up for it later by complaining all the time. But at the moment when they were asked to go into the desert, they went without questioning. And this is considered a great virtue. And as God describes it, God says, I took you into the desert to test you. Now, what was the test? Was it a test of their faith? There were other tests of faith. What was the uniqueness of this test? Every test that God puts us through brings out some quality within us. Because as we've already seen, The soul is a very complex being. It has a lot of hidden treasures, and if you just live your life on an ordinary day-to-day basis, you don't even get to use those treasures. So God puts a test in front of us, and the test forces us to dig a little deeper and use some of those unused, untapped treasures. So what was the test of going into the desert without food and drink? What was that test supposed to bring to the surface? What treasure was that supposed to uncover? It was supposed to uncover the ability to be indifferent. Food, no food, what's the difference? There are more interesting things to think about. To have or not to have, indifference. Not because I don't care, but because it doesn't really make a difference. Not important. You're talking to God, you want to go with God, God says desert, desert. What are you going to eat? What are we talking about eating for? It's like brides and grooms very often get frustrated. To them, the wedding is a wedding. It's the day of their life. And what are the parents haggling over? The caterer said that he can't make the dessert exactly the way you wanted it. And it's a crisis in the family. And the young couple are thinking, what are you doing? Why are you talking about food? It's our wedding. So it's not that they're indifferent because they're dull or lifeless. They're indifferent to the food and drink because there's something so much bigger and so much more significant that makes that whole issue fade into insignificance. In other words, the feelings or the needs that we generally experience may appear to be necessary. We dig a little deeper, we find out they're not necessary. And we develop an indifference that puts us above the problem. That's not lifeless, that's positive. Anytime a human being gets excited about an important project, you forget to eat. You literally don't get hungry. You forget to sleep. Can't go on for too long. But you can see how you can rise above what seems to be necessary human activity. We find that it's not necessary. Now you apply this to things a little more significant than food. If somebody has more than you, well, then you're going to be jealous, right? I mean, come on, that's a human being. You don't have to be. You can rise above that and be indifferent to that impulse or to that instinct. You don't have to be jealous. And if you feel jealous, you don't have to criticize and condemn them. If you feel jealous, you don't have to steal the object you're jealous over. You don't have to. Now, what does it mean you don't have to? It means you can step back and create an indifference. Somebody insults you. Must you take offense? You have to? There's no choice? You don't have to. Why? Because you can be indifferent. And in this case, the indifference is a virtue and a sign of life, not lifelessness. So when people say, whatever God gives me is fine, this too is for the good, where does that come from? You can say, oh, it comes from great faith. If you really believe and you're really convinced that nothing bad ever comes from heaven and that God always means well and does what's right even though you don't understand, well, if you believe all that, then you will be comfortable with whatever comes your way. But we know that there are people of great faith, or should we say had great faith, and then they went through a really difficult and painful experience and they didn't handle it very well. So then the argument is, well, that means that they never really believed. That's nasty. What it shows is that faith alone won't do it. Faith alone won't do it. Because you believe very strongly that God is right and God knows what He's doing. But what's happening is that you're suffering terrible grief or pain or tragedy, God forbid, whatever. The more you believe that God is in charge and that God is doing it and God is causing it, the harder it is to accept. It almost would be easier to not believe in God altogether. And why are you suffering? Life stinks. People suffer. And you hear intelligent people prefer that thinking to the thought that God is causing you pain. So what else do you need in addition to the faith? In addition to the faith, you also have to have a capacity for indifference. I thought I needed to be a rich man. It wouldn't spoil some vast eternal plan if I was a rich man. But on the other hand, I don't have to be rich. Then, whatever God chooses is fine with me. So the indifference makes it possible to be comfortable with not having, then knowing that this is God's choice makes it joyful. So we're supposed to accept pain or bad things graciously. You can't do that on faith alone. You also have to have this ability to be indifferent. Or like our grandparents used to say, whatever thing happened, could have been worse. Could have been worse means it's not the end of the world. Then if you say, in addition to that, this is God is doing this, then you can actually be gracious in a time of tragedy, whatever. So that's one example of a positive form of indifference. Because so many of our needs are not valid. So many of our wants are not necessary. And so many of our pleasures are not so healthy. So if you do without, now this woman started keeping kosher, woman in Minneapolis, started keeping kosher. And for a couple of months, the phone calls, I really can't eat that? And that's not kosher either? And if it's kosher, you can't mix it with milk? And if it's made on dairy equipment, it's not... It was just too much. There are so many things you can't eat. That was the first couple of months. The next couple of months, the telephone calls changed. I was at the supermarket. I'm so glad we keep kosher. I'd be eating Twinkies. You walk down the aisle of all these unhealthy junk foods, and you can't eat them because they're not kosher. So now she's saying, boy, it's so good to keep kosher. Keeps me healthy. I can walk right past those aisles and not even look. They're off the shopping list. So not everything we take pleasure in is healthy. So the ability to be indifferent, even when there is a desire, even when there is a want, that's an important part of being human. But let's talk about something much deeper and much more enjoyable. What people call, I'm not really familiar with this whole thing, but what people call meditation. What is meditation? Let's say meditation is a state of consciousness that is higher than your ordinary state of consciousness. Whatever that means. In Kabbalah, it describes the state of prophecy. And it seems to suggest that prophecy doesn't mean necessarily that God taps you on the shoulder and says, you got a minute? There's something I got to tell you, and I want you to tell everybody. It doesn't always work that way. A prophet is always in a state of prophecy, even when God is not communicating with him. He is a prophet because he functions, he lives on a higher level of consciousness. And on that level, he is capable of receiving a message from God and passing on the prophecy. But he's got to be that kind of person to begin with. What is that state of consciousness? So the Zohar says that in the vision of Yecheskel, Ezekiel, or the other prophets, they have these visions and they describe these scenes. In one of the descriptions, there's a short passage that describes the great thunder cloud, the storm wind, the great fire. And ordinarily we take this to mean God was showing him some symbolic message that is part of the prophecy. The Zohar says that those are stages of consciousness that he went through before he could receive the actual message from God. One of the things that is described there is this thing called chashmal. We really don't know how to translate that word. In modern Hebrew, chashmal means electricity. Because it's kind of assumed that whatever that thing was, it was energy, it was electricity. It was an electric moment, to put it poetically. The Zohar says, chashmal is composed of two words which mean silent speaking. Is that the still small voice? Is that a different kind of silent speaking? But this is part of the experience. So according to the Zohar, it goes like this. In order to get into this higher state of consciousness, you have to remove all thoughts, all distractions from your mind and heart. You have to become completely open to the higher awareness by removing every thought, every impulse from your mind. When that happens, it becomes very quiet. And then, according to the commentary, then any sound that occurs will be deafeningly loud. And that's the storm wind. First you have the quiet, then you have the storm wind. That doesn't mean that there's a lot of noise. It means every little noise becomes storming and loud. And then you go into this level where you are speaking silently. Let's bring all that down to earth. It's not that mysterious, but it is amazingly beautiful. There's a part of our soul, which we spoke about, that is noisy. It's very active. Activity is noise. Thinking is a noisy process. Because nobody else hears it, but you hear it. And your thoughts are constantly running. It's like a frenetic train, like a hyperactive child. It goes on and on and on, from one thing to the next, never stops. Of course, speech is noisy. Actions are noisy. Even emotions are noisy. They're tumultuous. I love, I hate, I used to love, I'm going to hate. There's all sorts of noise going on. Even in the brain. I don't understand. Oh, I do understand. Questions and answers going on inside the head. In addition to thinking. You think what you already know. But the mind is also wrestling with things it doesn't know. You can get to that part of the soul where all that is turned off. This happens generally when we experience something overwhelming? When does a person become speechless? When something is so overwhelmingly intense that there are no words. If it's even more intense, there are no thoughts. You don't even know what to think. You don't know what to feel. You actually go blank. But there's a way to do this consciously and purposefully, not waiting for something to overwhelm you. Because if there is such a place, then there must be a way to get there. So if a person sits down and tunes the world out, quiets down all the internal activity and noise, what's going to happen? When you get to this place of indifference, but positive indifference, what's there? So here's what happens to the soul. When the soul is first born, it is given a built-in mission. It's not born to fulfill itself, it's born to fulfill a divine purpose. And that purpose is programmed into the soul. And to put it literally, graphically, the soul promises to fulfill its mission. What happens when you reach that level where you're completely quiet, with no distractions whatsoever, what's going to happen is you're going to go into a place of stillness that is composed of three experiences. One is quiet. The second is a longing. And the third is an optimism. This is what the Zohar means, chashmal, a quiet voice. A quiet voice, silent speaking, means when you go into the place of silence, you will be spoken to. And in the silence, you will hear three things: calm, yearning, and hopefulness, optimism. And that's because there is more to the soul than we experience in our daily lives. So when you go into that place of indifference, you're not going to end up with a blank. Your mind will not go blank. It will go into silent experience, not no experience. And what is in that silence? A calmness, a yearning, and a hopefulness. Which means that even if you don't yearn, your soul has its own yearnings. Even if you're not hopeful, the soul has its own hope. And even if you're to tumult, the soul has its quiet place. There's more to us than meets the eye. What happens in that quiet place is that the soul starts to act like a soul. Not like a soul in a body, just like a soul. What is the activity of a soul? It is not distracted by worldly things. It yearns to fulfill the purpose for which it was created. And it is hopeful that it will succeed in that attempt. So when you go into that place, what you're going to experience is a flashback to the promise you made when you were conceived or when you were told you were going to be born, and you promised to fulfill your purpose and to fulfill God's intention. When that happens, then you gain a whole different attitude towards your physical existence. Because generally, we live in our physical space and we try to imagine what our soul is like. What does a soul do? Where does it come from? Where does it go? When you get into that quiet place, the perspective changes. Now it's the soul looking at your body or at your physical existence, trying to figure out what to do with it. What's that for? It's very different, the way we look at our soul and the way our soul looks at us. That's called higher consciousness. It doesn't mean something celestial and angels and seraphim. Higher consciousness means stop looking at your soul as if it is the stranger. Get a perspective from your soul who looks at your body and your physical existence like that's the stranger. So it's simply a change of perspective. Are you at the bottom looking up? Are you at the top looking down? Are you a body trying to figure out its soul? Or are you a soul trying to make sense of a body? Now, which one is better? Which one is more accurate? Whatever the body is going to understand about a soul, it's not going to be exactly correct. Why do we know what a soul is about? How does a body really understand a soul? But the soul looking at the body can work it out, can get the proper and true perspective. The body is the vehicle. The soul, that's the thing. The body thinks it's the thing, and that the soul is some kind of a tool. That's never correct. The soul knows that it is the responsible party. It carries the purpose. It is going to have to answer for itself after 120 years, not the body. So then it looks at the body as a vehicle, a tool. That's more correct. That is a better perspective. And you can call it higher perspective. So we've basically taken a mystical, mysterious, Kabbalistic concept, chashmal, bring it down to earth. Translate it into English. It's not so mysterious anymore. In that quietness, there is a longing. When we try to examine or judge the virtues and the value of a human being, what do we look for? Primarily, we look for intelligence. Because, without intelligence, you're not a human being. So when we meet somebody, what's our first impression? How smart they are. Second impression, how nice they are. Third impression, how funny they are. Or maybe that's the first impression. And then there's how capable are they, how talented. But we forget a very important quality that tells us more about a person than all of the above. And that is, what does a person yearn for? First of all, a person who doesn't yearn is an impoverished soul. If there's nothing you yearn for, then you're a shallow being. Sometimes, we have a certain, yearning has a certain negative connotation. Yearning means you don't have it. Yearning means you need it and you can't get it. It has a negative, painful connotation. But there's always something a person should be yearning for. It's what enriches the soul. It's a very precious part of being human. But what do we yearn for? If that's a precious impulse or a precious capacity, it would be shameful to abuse it and yearn for something silly or negative. So, not to yearn is an impoverishment of the soul. To yearn for wrong things, silly things, is to insult the soul. So when you really want to know the quality of a human being, you have to find out, what do you yearn for? What are you looking forward to? And I think that that's a big part of the emphasis on the belief in the eventual coming of Mashiach. Why do we have to be concerned with what's going to be? How do you know what's going to be? So God tells you. Fine, He knows. I don't know. Why should I get involved in that? Why not live in the moment? This is the world we have right now. Deal with it. What's going to be? What's your business? What's going to be? The idea of Mashiach is not a prediction for the future. It's a yearning that is supposed to be a deep part of our soul. What are we yearning for? We're yearning for a time when the world will be what God intended it to be. And this ain't it. This is not. So we're yearning for the time when the world will be a good world. A world God can be comfortable in. That's a good yearning. It shows where your heart and soul are at. A person who says, there have always been wars, there'll always be wars, just, get used to it, and don't be afraid of reality. That's a callous soul. And they don't really mean it either. It's easy to say when the war is someplace far away. Yeah, there'll always be wars. Someplace in the world there'll be a war. If you develop a little sensitivity, you really can't live like that. You can't dismiss it like that. So, the belief in the coming of Mashiach is basically a yearning for something better. So who believes in the coming of Mashiach? Anybody who says, this can't go on. If you've ever said that, if you've ever said that, you look in the newspapers and you say, this can't go on, well, then you believe in Mashiach. Because Mashiach means this is not going to go on forever. This has got to stop. And it will. So, yearning is a very precious part of the human experience. Without it, we're not quite human. Even if we're smart. Even if we're nice. It's not giving the soul its due credit. The soul provides us not only with intelligence, not only with will, not only with pleasure, but also with a yearning for something better. Where do we discover that yearning? In that silent place. If you take everything else away, what will remain to you? If you were not crazy, what would you be? Take away all the craziness, what's left? The quiet yearning of the soul. Now, yearning can be very frustrating if it goes on unsatisfied. So in addition to the yearning, the soul also has an optimism. When you see people, glasses half full, glasses half empty, where does that come from? Why are some people more optimistic, some people are less optimistic, some people are religiously pessimistic? Where does that come from? It comes from this place in the soul, where the soul knows that it has a mission and yearns to fulfill that mission. Now, is it optimistic about it, or is it pessimistic about it? The soul itself is never pessimistic, but there are degrees of optimism. So in some souls, that optimism is very strong. And in some souls, like anything else, is not that strong. In some souls, will is very strong. They're determined, willful people. Some people don't have such powerful will. It all depends on what your purpose in life is, because you are equipped precisely for that purpose. Some souls need a very strong will to be able to accomplish what they have to accomplish. Some souls don't need a strong will, but they need a lot of pleasure. Some souls don't need a lot of pleasure to accomplish their purpose, but they need a lot of intelligence. So they're geniuses. Some souls don't need so much optimism, because their path will not be that difficult or that mysterious. Some people are going to need a lot of optimism because they're headed for a difficult job, a difficult mission. So, in that place of quietness, we discover the soul's yearning and the soul's optimism. Where does that go? Where does it take you? It takes you to a whole new relationship between the soul and the body. The soul develops a healthy respect for the body, because without the body, it can't proceed on its mission. I think it's probably safe to say the soul stays in the body for 120 years. And that doesn't make sense. It's counterintuitive. The soul is intelligent, and the soul is sensitive, and the soul is righteous. Why would it stay in this world for more than a week? It really shouldn't. Now we're told, of course, that we are born against our will. Doesn't feel like it. We feel like we want to live. Why would the soul want to be in this world once it reads the newspapers? God forbid it goes through a painful experience. Why would it want to stay? Why? What's in it for the soul? There's only one real answer. I mean, you can't say survival instinct. That's not an answer. That's just describing the fact that the soul wants to stay. My question is why? Then people will say, well, it's because we don't want to die because we're afraid of the unknown. Really? Haven't you heard people say anything but this? Are we really more afraid of the unknown than of the known? When things become really painful and difficult, we're more afraid of the unknown? No. We're much more willing to risk the unknown rather than stay in the known that is really painful and bad. So there really isn't a good explanation why people come out of a horrendous experience and want to live. Why? The only real good answer is the soul recognizes the value of the body. What is the value of the body? It's the only way the soul can fulfill its promise. And what is important to the soul? A yearning to fulfill its mission. So there's a humility to the soul. A humility that allows the soul to get comfortable with a completely unfamiliar and unpleasant world. It accepts all of that, because if that's the way to get to fulfill my mission, well, fine. Not only begrudgingly, it develops a respect for the body, a concern for the welfare of the body. Be careful. Without that body, you can't do nothing. There are no mitzvahs you can do without a body. This is the trick. When you go into the higher state of consciousness, will you ever want to come back? There's a problem there. And there's a famous story in the Talmud about the sages who went into the garden, the secret garden, and 3 of them didn't make it. They didn't come back properly. Because once you've been there, why would you want to come back? So the ones who didn't make it, that I understand. The question is, how did one guy make it? How do you leave that place and come back to this tumult? It's because there's a humility in the soul that says, my world is nicer, holier, it's pure, it's gentle, it's clean, there's no conflict, but that's not where I belong. I belong in the body because that's where I fulfill my mission. So now listen to the conclusion, the punchline of this whole thing. We think of serving God as a religious thing. If you're religious, you want to get to heaven, or you want to be among the saints when they come marching in, so you do this, you don't do that, you keep kosher, you go for Shabbos, Yom Kippur, blah, blah, whatever, and that's your religion. That's not the way we should see it. Serving God is not a religion. Getting things from God, that's a religion. When you want God to be good to you, that's religion. When you want to serve God, it's not a religion. It is the nature of the soul. The nature of the soul. To the soul, the definition of life is mission. Life is mission. No mission, no life. Because without the mission, the soul cannot tolerate the body for a minute. The quiet place cannot put up with the noise for a minute. And yet it does put up with it for 120 years. Only for one reason. And it's not religion. The definition of life to a soul is the fulfillment of a mission. And that's why the most painful thing, the cruelest and most unusual punishment for a human being is to be imprisoned. To be locked up in a cell, particularly in isolation, where the soul cannot function and cannot serve and can't do the mitzvah. That is a punishment worse than death, because it's neither death nor life. Because to the soul, life means fulfilling a purpose. By this definition, the person who is completely healthy, physically, but doesn't believe that there is a mission, he doesn't believe he's on a mission, he doesn't believe that he has to account for himself, that person is not healthy. Most people would say, oh, he's not religious. It's not that he's not religious. He's not healthy. The healthiest person is the person who has a clear picture of his mission and he's going for it. If you have that, then no matter what's going on in the body, you are healthy. Very literally, a guy with 2 healthy legs but doesn't think he has any place to go is a lot sicker than a person who knows where he has to go, doesn't have the legs. That makes sense? If you know where you have to go and you don't have legs, you find a way, you get there. You're a healthy human being. A little inconvenienced. But a person who has legs but doesn't think there's any place to go, that's a sick person. There's no life there from the perspective of the soul. The perspective of the body is, I got 2 feet. What are you bothering me with purpose? Like somebody once said, what is the American creed? Most countries have a philosophy, good or bad, whatever. What is America's philosophy? He was being critical, of course. He said, America's philosophy, if you ask the average American, His philosophy is, don't get in my way. Stay out of my way. Personal freedom. I can do whatever I want. Don't get in my way. So you hear them say this, like, don't get in my way. You say, whoa, whoa. Where are you going? No place. Just don't get in my way. That's not life. That's like the feet. Feeling good, look at the soul and say, what do you want? What do I need with you? I'm healthy. Really? So where are you going? No place. That's the lower perspective. The higher perspective is, I have a divine purpose. And amazingly, paradoxically, I need feet to do it. So I'll take care of my feet. That's what meditation should be. Now, how do we get to this quiet place? Do you have to sit in a certain position? I don't think so, because Jews never did that. Do you have to hum a certain sound? I don't think so. I mean, maybe that works, but it's not the way we do it. To get to that quiet place, you simply have to face your Creator. What does it mean to come to shul, to come to the synagogue, to pray, whether it's 3 times a day, every day, or twice a year on Yom Kippur? What are you doing when you come to pray? You're coming to ask for stuff? A little bit. But before you can ask, you have to know who you're talking to. So when you come to pray, you're basically coming to face your Creator, or your Father in heaven, depending on what your relationship with Him happens to be that year. If it's good, He's your Father in heaven. If not, He's your Creator. You don't want to get too intimate, but He's the Creator. Or He's your King. Or He's your God, the God of your fathers. Whatever the relationship is, coming to pray, coming to synagogue, coming to shul, means you're coming to face Him. In that alone, you can get to that quiet place. Because if you're standing in front of God, what else are you going to think about? The game is over. It's like being called into the principal's office. Remember that experience? Today it doesn't mean anything, but in our days, being called into a principal's office was a major event. And what happened? I mean, at the time, being a child, you saw it in a childish way. But look back at it. What happened? You're wild, you're crazy, you're fighting, you're playing, and you come into the principal's office. What is that? You're faking? In the principal's office, the games are over. It's showdown. It's a time of truth. No more games. Even with your teacher, you could say, no, I didn't, he did, she did, they told me, they... Not with the principal. You don't play those games with a principal. When you're standing in front of the principal, it's quiet. Everything's quiet. All your excuses, your rationalizations, your arguments, gone. You're just waiting for the verdict to come down. But there's a silence there. Of course, it's a silence that comes from fear, which is not completely silent. Your stomach is making noises. But you can see how, in the presence of a principle, the game is over. You become quiet. In the presence of God, not out of fear, but simply out of realization. When you stand in front of God, you have to answer one question and one question only. You've been good? You're doing your thing? You become quiet. And you don't have to be in any particular sitting position. You can even be shuckling. Standing before God, if we simply allow ourselves to do it, will take us into this quiet place. And in this quiet place, you suddenly start to yearn. You wish life had been different. You wish you would do more. You wish you were better. It's not an empty, vain wish. You're hearing your soul. You're hearing your soul's yearning. And you walk away not depressed, optimistic. I am a Jew. I will be a Jew. I will serve God. It'll be good. Then, of course, you go back to the tumult and you forget about it. But that's life. To experience that, even once in a lifetime, is fantastic. Once a year, that's good. Once a day, be careful. You might become a prophet. You're getting a little holy here. But to feel that every day would be so enriching. You would be so human. Now that is a positive form of indifference. When we become indifferent to one dimension of life, we open ourselves up to a whole other dimension. What helps get there? You keep kosher. You say no to certain foods and you develop an indifference. You don't need that. If there's no kosher food around, I don't need any food at all. You become detached. You observe Shabbos, for example. For 24 hours, you don't need anything. There are people who are heavy smokers, chain smokers, but they're religious. So on Shabbos, it's out of the question. There's no smoking. For 24 hours, they don't need it. Well, 23 hours. The last hour starts to get a little difficult. But for 23 hours, they don't need it. It's not that they walk around in agony with withdrawal symptoms. They don't need it. You give charity, you develop an indifference. I don't need all the money I have. I don't need it. How did I develop that? I kept giving it away. So all of these activities, all of these mitzvah behaviors make it easier to get to that higher perspective. Because we don't buy into the assumptions. You got to have one of these. You got to have one of those. You got to put some money away. You got to invest in this. You got to make sure about that. Well, don't gotta. If it's a good thing, I'll do it. Not a good thing, I don't gotta. It's not like, well, you see that outfit? Oh, gotta have one. See that new car? Gotta have one. But you don't. That's the lower perspective. To get to the higher perspective is not that difficult. No, on Shabbos you don't gotta have anything. Not just you don't gotta have that car, you don't gotta have a car at all. It's liberating. And that doesn't leave you nowhere. It doesn't just leave you without a car. It doesn't just leave you on foot. It gives you that higher perspective. So a secular view of a human being is frightening. If I don't have this, that, and the other, I'll be nothing. A more spiritual view is, if you don't have this, that, and the other, you'll have your soul. You won't be nothing. When you go into that quiet place, it's not nothing. It's an indifference that is productive. not just a blank space. So it's not a transcendental meditation. You're not transcending, you're getting into something better, something active and real. It speaks to you, but it speaks quietly, without the tumult. So we have covered 3 major areas in the human psyche: the will, the pleasure, and the indifference. Those are called the higher powers, even on a secret. We cover our heads, men cover their heads, because 10 parts of your soul are within your system. 2 parts are above your system. The 2 parts are your will and your pleasure. They're not part of the system. They direct the system. Will tells the mind how to think, not how to think, to think. Will orders the emotions to feel. But it's above. So to be aware of that additional part of soul that we have, we wear something on our heads to remind us of what is above us. Generally, if you ask people, what is that, what is that kippah, what is it? To remind you that there's a God above. Generally, that's correct, but let's get more specific. What part of God are you talking about? You're talking about the part of your soul that is a little closer to God. And that's your will and your pleasure. Hasidim take things literally. There are 2 parts that are above your head. Well, then you have to have 2 hats. Then you have to have a yarmulke and a hat on top of that. So if you really want to know what this is, the kippah is the symbol of the will, and the hat is the symbol of pleasure. And why don't women wear hats? Because women cover their hair, which is very different from covering your head. It's got a different function, different purpose, and so on. The way a woman remains in touch with her higher powers, her will and her pleasure, is through modesty in general. For the man, the additional modesty of covering the head works. For women, it's modesty in general. Because what is greater than my greatest pleasure? That's where we have to signify or put the reminder, there's something greater than that. So modesty in general does that. But now you know why Hasidim wear a hat. You never knew that. You learn a lot when you come to shul. Any questions so far? Because after this, it's finished. Anything?
No.
Yes?
So you're talking about your soul having this mission, and it always seems that it's up to us to figure out what that mission is. But then we also hear from other places that when you're born, you can see whatever, it's programmed into your soul. So is it one of these things where you just intuitively know when it's right, or how do you, it could be sometimes difficult to figure out what that mission is?
It's a good question. Viktor Frankl says that the essence of a human being is the search for meaning. What is meaning? Well, whatever it means to you. What we're saying is something different. The soul is programmed with a mission. It doesn't have to find one. It is born with a mission. And therefore, the mission has to be told or has to be described so that the soul can go about doing it correctly. And that mission is to serve God according to His instructions, which He gives us in the Torah on Mount Sinai. Actually, even though there are 613 instructions plus 1 million details, in spite of that, we're still not sure. We know what we're supposed to do. We don't know what our individual function is. An entire congregation gets together on Yom Kippur, right? 500 people. They're all there to do the same thing, to fast and to pray. And what are they going to pray? The exact same words. They're all going to say the exact same words. And each one of them is sitting there thinking, what am I doing? What is my purpose? In other words, if you're going to keep kosher, well, everybody keeps kosher. What's your purpose? You're going to put on tefillin? Every Jew puts on tefillin. You're going to light a Shabbos candle? It's been done. You won't be the first. Although we're all doing the same mitzvah, no two mitzvahs are ever the same. You can't compare a woman in Germany in the 30s who lights a Shabbos candle to a woman in Morocco in the Middle Ages. It's not the same. I mean, it is the same, and it's not the same. You really can't even compare the mother lighting the Shabbos candles and the daughter lighting it right along with her. They're doing the same thing? Yes and no. So what is your purpose? Your purpose is to bring your particular set of experiences, your sensitivities, your hang-ups, your shtick, to the same mitzvah that other people do with their shtick, with their circumstances, with their challenges. And the Torah guarantees, when you put on tefillin, no one has ever put on tefillin like that before, because God doesn't repeat himself. If you were doing exactly the same mitzvah somebody else was doing, one of you isn't necessary. Let's take it a step further. You put on tefillin today, and then you put on tefillin tomorrow. It's not the same act. You'll do it the same way. It's not the same mitzvah. You've changed since yesterday. Yesterday you had more time. Today you don't have time. And you do it anyway. It's a whole different mitzvah. So there are certain nuances that make you different from everybody else. Oh, that's my purpose. But our purpose, we all know, that's not left to the imagination. I guess that's the power of doing a mitzvah. Thinking, my parents did this, my grandparents, my great-grandparents, all the way back to Avraham or to Moses. That's awesome. An unbroken chain of continued, and then on the other hand, it's not like any mitzvah that was ever done before. And of course, that's why when Jews came to America at the turn of the century, they weren't going to do mitzvahs. Because not in America. You don't do mitzvahs in America. It's for Europe, for Babylonia, not America. And when Jews ended up doing mitzvahs in America, it's a different mitzvah. It's the same mitzvah, but it's a whole different mitzvah. So you get both continuity and originality when you do a mitzvah. You're connected in an unbroken chain, and you're doing something that was never done before. There's that joke about the guy you ask a guy in Russia, would he like to put on tefillin? And he says, what are you kidding? This is Russia. When I get to Israel. Yeah, so you meet him in Israel. And you say, would you like to put on tefillin? He says, not in Israel. In Israel, you don't have to put on tefillin. Everything is Jewish here. If I was in America, I'd put on tefillin. You meet him a few years later in America, and you say, would you like to put on tefillin? He says, this is not Israel. So where is the right place? See, each place is different. It's not the same. You put on tefillin in Russia, it's Russian tefillin. You put on tefillin in Israel, it's Israeli tefillin. It's the same pair of tefillin, but the experience is completely different. Anything else?
question was about the purpose, but every soul comes in with the same purpose.
Right. So every soul is given his purpose. But then every soul is given circumstances in which to fulfill that purpose that makes you unique. And that's why sometimes a person will say, under my circumstances, I must have some other purpose. The Jew in Russia under Stalin said, my purpose is to be an observant Jew? Can't be. It can't be. This is Russia. Must be something else. No, it's the same purpose under exacting circumstances. I said to this guy was saying, I've become more religious, I've become more observant, my wife doesn't want, so I'm thinking of getting divorced. And I think somebody had actually encouraged it. Yes, you have to, because you got to keep the mitzvahs, and if she doesn't want, you just divorce her and go on serving God. But when I spoke to him, I said, who advised that? Who have you been? Look at the facts. You're 40 years old. You never felt like being observant until last year. And what made you suddenly get excited? You had an experience. You went to a class, something clicked, you have children, you're looking for something to teach them. All of a sudden, the circumstances come together, and you're now inspired to keep the mitzvahs. Why didn't this happen 20 years ago? Because you weren't paying attention? No. 20 years ago, God did not give you that opportunity. Last year, He gave you the opportunity. So what does that tell you? While you were single, God didn't care for you to be observant. Now, as a couple, as a married man, God introduces you to Judaism. You're going to get divorced? He doesn't need you anymore. He needs you to serve Him in the circumstances in which He puts you. Anytime a person says, I will serve God, but not here. Not like this. Someplace else. Under different circumstances. So all I have to do is rearrange the circumstances, then I'll be able to serve Him. Well, then He doesn't need you anymore. He needs you in this circumstance. Every revolution in history is always the same thing. We are going to be good. We're going to be very good. We just have to change one little thing. We got to depose the Shah, we got to rebel against the emperor, we got to kill a few people, then we'll be very good. No, just we'll move the border, that's all. We'll throw out certain people, then we'll be good. As soon as you say, I will be good when, you're no good. That's a bad person. A bad person is not someone who gets up and says, I'm going to be bad. There are very few people like that. Every person gets up and said, I will make the world better. Just kill off a couple of people. Won't take long. Give me a couple of days, I'll rearrange, then we'll be wonderful. Every revolution does that. And every revolution turns out to be worse than what it got rid of. Because it made a condition on being good. Goodness has no such restrictions. If you really want to be good, good exists everywhere. Now, in this circumstance and in this place. Now you can't be good, then you can't be good. So the revolution really is looking for a more comfortable life. It's not really looking for a better life. Because better, you can be better today. With or without the revolution. And that's why we look forward to Mashiach and we want Mashiach. In the meantime, you do what you're supposed to do. You don't say, well, without Mashiach, I'm not doing it.